The evening sun was setting behind the tall oak trees that lined Maple Ridge Boulevard, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. Officer Blake Rodriguez had been patrolling this quiet neighborhood for 3 years, and he knew every corner, every house, and most of the faces that belonged here. This was the kind of place where people drove expensive cars, had two-story homes with white picket fences, and rarely called the police for anything more serious than a noise complaint. Blake was cruising slowly down the street in his patrol car when something caught his eye. A black man in a dark business suit was walking along the sidewalk, carrying what looked like a leather briefcase. The man appeared to be in his 40s, well-dressed and walking with purpose. But something about the scene didn't sit right with Blake. It wasn't that the man was doing anything wrong. He was simply walking. But in Blake's mind, questions started forming. What was someone like him doing in this neighborhood at this time of evening? Most of the residents here drove everywhere they went. People didn't usually walk around here, especially not dressed in business attire when it was getting dark. Blake had grown up in a different part of town, where his father had always warned him to be careful about who he trusted. "You can't be too careful these days," his dad would say. "Just keep your eyes open." Those words had stuck with Blake throughout his career in law enforcement. He told himself he was just being cautious, just doing his job. The man continued walking, seemingly unaware that he was being watched. Blake decided to slow his patrol car down and keep an eye on things. The man turned onto Elm Street, one of the more expensive blocks in the area. Blake's radio was quiet and his shift was almost over, but something was nagging at him. As the man walked past a large house with a "for sale" sign, Blake noticed him glance at the property. That was it. Blake's mind immediately went to the recent reports of break-ins in nearby neighborhoods. Sure, there hadn't been any in Maple Ridge itself, but you never knew. Better safe than sorry, he thought. Blake pulled his patrol car over to the curb and got out. The man, whose name was actually Dr. Antonio Williams, noticed the police car and felt his stomach drop slightly. He had been walking home from his office after a long day of meetings about community outreach programs. His car was in the shop and the evening air had seemed perfect for a peaceful walk through this neighborhood where he had recently moved. Antonio had experienced moments like this before. The slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he made sure his hands were visible, the mental preparation for what might come next. He continued walking at the same pace, hoping the officer was responding to something else entirely. "Excuse me," Blake called out as he approached. His voice was polite but firm. "Could I have a word with you?" Antonio stopped and turned around with a calm expression. "Good evening, officer. How can I help you?" Blake studied Antonio's face, looking for signs of nervousness or guilt. To him, the man seemed too calm, too composed. "I'm Officer Rodriguez with the city police. I was just wondering what brings you to this neighborhood today." Antonio felt a familiar weight in his chest. He had dealt with situations like this more times than he cared to count, but each time still stung. "I live here," he replied simply. "I'm walking home from work." Blake raised an eyebrow. He had thought he knew most of the residents in this area. "Oh, really? Which house is yours?" Antonio pointed to a 2-story colonial house at the end of the block. "The blue one with the white trim? I moved in about 6 months ago." Blake looked in the direction Antonio was pointing. He did remember seeing moving trucks on that street a while back, but he had never actually seen who had moved in. "I see. And where are you coming from today?" "My office downtown," Antonio replied, maintaining his polite tone despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the questioning. Blake noticed the briefcase in Antonio's hand. "What kind of work do you do?" Antonio paused for a moment. He could feel the conversation heading in a direction he had experienced too many times before. "I work for the city." "City work, huh?" Blake's tone suggested he was looking for more details. "What department?" Antonio was growing tired of the questions, but knew that staying calm was his best option. "I work in administration." Blake wasn't satisfied with the vague answer. Something about the whole situation still felt off to him. The expensive briefcase, the business suit, the way the man was being evasive about his job. "Mind if I see some identification?" Antonio reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, which clearly showed his address matching the house he had pointed to. Blake examined the license carefully. The name read Dr. Antonio Williams, and the address was indeed on Elm Street. But Blake's suspicions weren't completely settled. "What's in the briefcase?" Antonio felt his patience being tested. Work documents. Reports and files. Would you mind opening it for me? This was the moment Antonio had been dreading. He knew his rights, and he knew he didn't have to comply with this request without probable cause. But he also knew that refusing might escalate the situation in ways he didn't want to deal with. Officer Rodriguez, Antonio said carefully. I'm happy to cooperate, but I have to ask what this is about. Have I done something wrong? Blake felt a flash of irritation at what he perceived as defiance. I'm just doing a routine check. There have been some break-ins in nearby areas, and I'm making sure everything is secure around here. Antonio nodded slowly. I understand your concern for the neighborhood's safety. I share that concern since I live here too. But I haven't committed any crime, and I'm simply walking home from work. By now, a few neighbors had noticed the interaction. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was peeking through her curtains. Mr. Chen, who was watering his garden, had stopped what he was doing and was watching the scene unfold. Blake was aware of the growing audience, which made him feel like he needed to assert his authority more firmly. Sir, I'm going to need you to open that briefcase. Antonio took a deep breath. He had been in situations like this before, but it never got easier. He was a respected professional, a community leader, and a homeowner in this very neighborhood. Yet here he was, being treated like a suspect for the crime of walking while black. The sun had set completely now, and the street lights were beginning to flicker on. What had started as a peaceful evening walk was turning into something much more complicated. Antonio could see more neighbors gathering, and he knew that whatever happened next would be witnessed by the entire community. He looked at Officer Rodriguez, seeing not malice, but misguided suspicion. Antonio realized this moment could go in many different directions, and the choice he made now would affect not just himself, but potentially many others who might find themselves in similar situations in the future. The briefcase felt heavier in his hand as he considered his next move. Antonio looked at the briefcase in his hand, then back at Officer Rodriguez. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He had two choices: comply with a request he knew was unreasonable, or stand up for his rights and risk making the situation worse. Officer Rodriguez, Antonio said, his voice steady but firm. I respect your position, but I need to understand what reasonable suspicion you have that would require me to open my personal belongings. Blake felt his jaw tighten. In his experience, innocent people didn't ask questions like that. They cooperated. They wanted to help clear things up quickly. This man's calm confidence was starting to feel like defiance, and Blake didn't like being challenged. Sir, I explained that there have been break-ins in the area. I'm conducting a routine investigation, and your cooperation would be appreciated. Antonio noticed how Blake's tone had shifted. The polite facade was slipping away, replaced by something more authoritative and demanding. Officer, I haven't seen any news reports about break-ins in this immediate neighborhood. Could you tell me specifically what incidents you're referring to? Blake felt heat rising in his face. This guy was questioning him, asking for details like he had some kind of authority to do so. I don't need to provide you with details of ongoing investigations. What I need is for you to cooperate with a simple request. Antonio reached into his pocket slowly, making sure his movements were clearly visible. He pulled out his cell phone. I'm going to record this interaction for both of our protection. Put that phone away, Blake said quickly. You don't have permission to record me. Antonio held the phone steady. Actually, I do have the right to record police interactions in public spaces. This is for your protection as well as mine. Blake had dealt with people recording him before, and he hated it. It made him feel like every word and action was being scrutinized, like people were just waiting for him to make a mistake. Sir, if you don't put that phone away and comply with my requests, I'm going to have to consider this interference with a police investigation. By now, more neighbors had gathered. Mrs. Patterson had come out onto her front porch. The Chen family was standing in their driveway, clearly concerned about what they were witnessing. A teenager from the house next door was also recording with his phone from his bedroom window. Antonio could feel the eyes of the community on him. These were his neighbors, people he waved to when he walked his dog, people whose children played in the same parks his own kids visited on weekends. He knew that whatever happened here would be discussed at neighborhood barbecues and PTA meetings for months to come. Officer Rodriguez, Antonio said, making sure to speak clearly for the recording, I want to cooperate with you, but I also want to make sure my rights are respected. Could you please tell me your badge number? Blake's patience was running out completely. My badge number? Why do you need my badge number? For my records. And I'd like to know how to contact your supervisor if needed. That was the last straw for Blake. In his mind, this man had gone from suspicious to openly defiant. Asking for badge numbers and supervisor information was what people did when they were planning to file complaints. It was what guilty people did when they were trying to turn the tables and make the officer look bad. Sir, you're starting to interfere with my investigation. If you don't comply with my requests immediately, I'm going to have to place you under arrest. Antonio felt his heart rate increase, but his voice remained calm. Under arrest for what specifically? Obstruction of justice, interference with police duties, and failure to comply with lawful orders. Antonio knew enough about law to recognize that none of those charges would likely stick in court, but he also knew that being arrested would mean being handcuffed, taken to jail, processed, and having to call a lawyer. It would mean his wife would worry when he didn't come home. It would mean his teenage daughter would see her father on the evening news being led away in handcuffs. It would mean his colleagues would hear about their director being arrested before he even had a chance to explain what happened. Mrs. Patterson called out from her porch. Officer, is everything okay? Dr. Williams is our neighbor. He lives right there in the blue house. Blake glanced over at her, annoyed by the interruption. Ma'am, please stay back. This is police business. But Mrs. Patterson's words had an impact on some of the other neighbors. Mr. Chen approached slowly, his hands visible and his demeanor respectful but concerned. Officer, I can vouch for this man, Mr. Chen said. He lives in our neighborhood. I've seen him many times walking his dog, taking out his trash. He's a good neighbor. Blake felt like the whole situation was spiraling out of his control. Now he had multiple people questioning his judgment, and this man was still recording everything with his phone. He felt like he was being made to look foolish, like his authority was being undermined in front of half the neighborhood. Everyone needs to step back and let me do my job, Blake said loudly. This man was acting suspiciously, and I have every right to investigate. Antonio looked around at his neighbors, feeling both grateful for their support and concerned that the situation might escalate further. He made a decision that he hoped would de-escalate things. Officer Rodriguez, he said, I'm going to comply with your request to open my briefcase, but I want it clearly understood that I'm doing this voluntarily to help resolve this situation, not because I'm required to do so. Blake felt a moment of satisfaction. Finally, the man was going to cooperate. Antonio set his briefcase on the hood of a nearby parked car and opened it slowly. Inside were exactly what he had said would be there. Work documents, reports, a laptop, pens, and a few business cards. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, nothing that would justify the treatment he had received. Blake looked through the contents, feeling somewhat deflated. Everything appeared to be exactly what a professional would carry. City documents, budget reports, meeting notes, but he still wasn't ready to back down completely. What kind of city work do you do exactly? Blake asked, picking up one of the reports. Antonio hesitated. He could end this entire situation right now by simply telling the officer who he was. But part of him wanted to see how far this would go, how the officer would behave when he didn't know he was dealing with someone who would have the power to affect his career. I work in community relations, Antonio said simply. Blake flipped through a few pages of the report. The language was formal and bureaucratic, talking about community outreach programs, diversity initiatives, and police community partnerships. It was exactly the kind of government paperwork he had seen before. But instead of feeling satisfied that the man was telling the truth, Blake felt embarrassed. Here he was, going through this man's personal belongings in front of half the neighborhood and finding exactly nothing suspicious. The problem was, he had gone too far to back down gracefully now. The teenager in the window was still recording. Mrs. Patterson was still watching from her porch. Mr. Chen was still standing nearby with a concerned expression, and Dr. Antonio Williams was still holding his phone, documenting every moment of an interaction that had started with a simple walk home from work and had turned into something that would change both of their lives, in ways neither of them could yet. Imagine, the streetlights were fully on now, casting everything in a harsh, artificial glow. What should have been a quiet evening in a peaceful neighborhood had become a scene that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Blake Rodriguez stood there holding Antonio's driver's license, the weight of the moment beginning to settle on him. He had gone through the briefcase and found nothing but legitimate city documents. The neighbors were watching. The phones were recording, and he was starting to realize that he might have made a serious mistake. Antonio closed his briefcase and waited patiently. He could see the wheels turning in Officer Rodriguez's head. The man was clearly trying to figure out how to end this interaction without losing face completely. Dr. Williams, Blake said, reading the name on the license more carefully this time. Something about that name was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. You said you work in community relations for the city? That's correct. Blake looked at the license again. Dr. Antonio Williams. The address was definitely in this neighborhood. The man was clearly educated, well-dressed, and professional. And yet something about the name kept nagging at him. Mrs. Patterson called out from her porch again. Officer, Dr. Williams just moved into the neighborhood a few months ago. He's been wonderful. Always friendly, always polite. His daughter plays with my granddaughter. Blake glanced over at her, then back at Antonio. The situation was becoming more uncomfortable by the minute. He was starting to realize that he had stopped and questioned a respected community member for essentially no reason other than his own assumptions. What specific department do you work for? Blake asked, hoping to wrap this up quickly and move on. Antonio paused. This was the moment of truth. He could continue to be vague, or he could tell Officer Rodriguez exactly who he was dealing with. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here was a police officer treating him like a suspect, while having no idea that Antonio was actually his department's new liaison for community relations and civil rights. I'm the director of civil rights for the city, Antonio said quietly. Blake's face went completely pale. The driver's license slipped slightly in his hand as the full impact of those words hit him like a freight train. Director of Civil Rights. Dr. Antonio Williams. Now he remembered where he had heard that name. It had been in the police department's morning briefings just last month. The new director who was going to be working with their department on community outreach programs. The man who was supposed to help improve police community relations. The person who would be evaluating their department's practices and recommending changes. Blake felt like the ground had opened up beneath his feet. This wasn't just any resident he had stopped and questioned. This was the one person in the entire city government whose job it was to investigate exactly the kind of situation he had just created. You're the new civil rights director? Blake stammered. I am. The neighbors who were close enough to hear this exchange looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Mrs. Patterson put her hand over her mouth. Mr. Chen shook his head slowly. The teenager in the window was still recording, now with even more interest than before. Blake's mind was racing. How had he not recognized the name immediately? He had seen it in memos, heard it mentioned in meetings. Dr. Antonio Williams was supposed to visit their precinct next week for an introduction meeting. He was going to be working directly with officers on sensitivity training and community engagement programs. Sir, I had no idea, Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Antonio looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. And why should that matter, Officer Rodriguez? Should the way you treat citizens depend on who they are, or what position they hold? Blake felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. No, sir. Of course not. I just meant... You meant that you might have approached this situation differently if you had known who I was. Blake couldn't find words to respond, because Antonio was absolutely right. If he had known he was dealing with the director of civil rights, he never would have made the stop in the first place. He would have driven right past, maybe even waved politely. Antonio continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying a weight that made everyone listening understand the gravity of the moment. Officer Rodriguez, I want you to think about what just happened here. I was walking home from work in my own neighborhood. I was dressed professionally, carrying work documents, behaving peacefully. And yet you stopped me, questioned me, demanded to search my belongings and threatened to arrest me. What reasonable suspicion did you have that I had committed a crime? Blake looked down at his feet. The honest answer was none. He had stopped Antonio because he had made assumptions based on his appearance and his presence in a predominantly white neighborhood. It was exactly the kind of racial profiling that the police department had been trying to address in their training programs. The training programs that Antonio would now be overseeing. I was just There had been reports of break-ins, Blake said weakly. In this neighborhood? Blake's silence was answer enough. Antonio handed him a business card from his wallet. Officer Rodriguez, I want you to have my card. When you get back to the station tonight, I want you to think very carefully about what happened here. I want you to think about how this interaction started, how it progressed, and how it might have ended differently if my neighbors hadn't been here to witness it. Blake took the card with trembling hands. It was an official city business card with Antonio's name, title, and contact information. More importantly, Antonio continued, I want you to think about how many other people might have experienced what I just experienced, but without the benefit of having neighbors who know them, without the education to know their rights, and without the professional status that makes you suddenly concerned about your behavior. The weight of Antonio's words settled over the entire scene. The neighbors who were watching began to understand that they had just witnessed something much more significant than a simple misunderstanding. Blake knew his career was probably over. At minimum, he would face disciplinary action. At worst, he might lose his job entirely. The irony was devastating. He had been so focused on being cautious and doing his job well that he had created exactly the kind of incident that would end his career in law enforcement. Dr. Williams, Blake said, his voice barely audible. I apologize. I made a mistake. Antonio looked at him for a long moment. Officer Rodriguez, an apology is a start, but what matters now is what you do with this experience, what you learn from it, and whether you use this moment to become a better officer and a better person. Blake nodded, knowing that nothing he could say would undo what had happened. Antonio closed his briefcase and picked up his phone, ending the recording. I'll be in touch with your department soon. We have a lot of work to do. As Antonio walked toward his house, the neighbors slowly began to disperse. Mrs. Patterson gave him a supportive wave. Mr. Chen nodded respectfully. The teenager in the window finally stopped recording and closed his curtains. Blake stood alone under the streetlight, holding a business card and the pieces of a career that might never recover from this single evening. He had wanted to protect the neighborhood from suspicious activity, but instead, he had created the exact kind of incident that would be studied in police training academies as an example of how not to do the job. The quiet suburban street returned to normal, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. By the time Blake Rodriguez returned to the police station that night, his hands were still shaking. He sat in his patrol car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at Dr. Williams' business card and trying to figure out what to do next. He knew he had to report the incident, but he also knew that doing so might end his career. Meanwhile, across town, Antonio Williams sat in his living room with his wife, Carmen. Showing her the video he had recorded on his phone, Carmen watched in silence, her expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. Tony, this is exactly what we were worried about when we moved to this neighborhood, she said when the video ended. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Antonio rubbed his temples. The worst part is this happens to people every day, but most of them don't have the resources or the position to do anything about it. They just have to accept it and move on. What are you going to do? Antonio looked at his phone, then at the business card he had given Officer Rodriguez. I'm going to do my job. The next morning, the teenager who had recorded the incident from his window uploaded the video to social media. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. The headline that accompanied most shares read, Police officer racially profiles civil rights director in his own neighborhood. Local news stations picked up the story by noon. By evening, it was trending on national social media platforms. The video clearly showed the entire interaction. Antonio walking peacefully, Officer Rodriguez approaching without apparent cause, the questioning, the demand to search the briefcase, and the shocked reaction when Antonio revealed his position. Chief Patricia Gonzalez was in her office when the mayor called her directly. Patricia, we have a problem, Mayor Johnson said. Have you seen the video that's going viral about one of your officers? Chief Gonzalez had indeed seen it. She had watched it 3 times, each viewing making her feel sicker about the situation. Yes, I've seen it. We're investigating the matter internally. This isn't just an internal matter anymore. The officer in question racially profiled our civil rights director, the person whose job it is to work with your department on preventing exactly this kind of incident. Chief Gonzalez knew the mayor was right. This wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. This was about the entire department's credibility when it came to community relations. "I want Officer Rodriguez suspended immediately pending a full investigation," the mayor continued. "And I want you to personally meet with Dr. Williams to discuss how we're going to handle this situation." Within hours, Blake Rodriguez was called into Chief Gonzalez's office. He had barely slept the night before, and he knew this conversation would determine his future in law enforcement. "Officer Rodriguez," Chief Gonzalez said, her voice stern but not unkind, "I've reviewed the video of your interaction with Dr. Williams last night. I've also read your incident report. Do you want to explain to me how this happened?" Blake had prepared for this moment, but sitting across from his chief, he found it hard to put his thoughts into words. "Chief, I thought I was doing my job. I saw someone who looked out of place in that neighborhood, and I approached him to investigate." "Looked out of place how exactly?" Blake realized there was no way to answer that question without admitting to racial profiling. I made assumptions based on his appearance." Chief Gonzalez leaned back in her chair. "Officer Rodriguez, you've been with this department for 8 years. You've completed sensitivity training multiple times. You know our policies on racial profiling. What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking clearly. I let my assumptions guide my actions instead of following proper procedures." The chief appreciated his honesty, but she also knew that honesty alone wouldn't fix the damage that had been done. "Blake, I'm suspending you without pay pending a full investigation. You'll also be required to attend additional training before you can return to active duty, if you're allowed to return at all." Blake nodded. He had expected this outcome. "I understand, Chief." That afternoon, Chief Gonzalez drove to the Civil Rights Office to meet with Dr. Williams personally. She had never met him before, despite knowing that he would be working closely with her department. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Antonio's office was on the 3rd floor of the city administration building. When Chief Gonzalez arrived, she was impressed by the professionalism of the space. The walls were lined with law books, civil rights awards, and photographs of Antonio with various community leaders. "Dr. Williams, I want to personally apologize for what happened last night," Chief Gonzalez said as they shook hands. "Officer Rodriguez's actions do not represent the values of our department." Antonio gestured for her to sit down. "Chief Gonzalez, I appreciate you coming here personally, but I hope you understand that this incident represents exactly the kind of systemic issue we need to address together." "I do understand that, and I want you to know that Officer Rodriguez has been suspended pending a full investigation." Antonio nodded. "That's appropriate. But I hope we can use this incident as more than just a disciplinary matter. This is an opportunity to examine our training programs, our policies, and our culture." Over the next hour, they discussed the broader implications of the incident. Antonio explained that he had dealt with similar situations throughout his life, and that Blake Rodriguez wasn't necessarily a bad person, but rather someone who had been shaped by unconscious biases that were common throughout society. "The question," Antonio said, "is whether we use this incident to punish one officer and move on, or whether we use it to create meaningful change in how your department interacts with the community." Chief Gonzalez was impressed by Antonio's measured response. Despite being the victim of clear racial profiling, he was focused on solutions rather than revenge. "What would you recommend?" she asked. "I think Officer Rodriguez should face appropriate consequences for his actions. But I also think he should be part of the solution. Sometimes the people who make these mistakes can become the most effective advocates for change, if they're willing to do the work to understand what they did wrong and why." By the end of the week, the video had been viewed millions of times. News outlets across the country had picked up the story. Antonio found himself being interviewed on television, always emphasizing the systemic nature of the problem and the need for comprehensive reform rather than simply punishing one individual. "This isn't about Officer Rodriguez," he said in one interview. "This is about a culture that teaches people to be suspicious of others based on their race or appearance. If we only focus on punishing individuals without addressing the underlying issues, we'll keep seeing these incidents happen over and over again." Blake Rodriguez, meanwhile, was at home, watching the news coverage and feeling the weight of his actions. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, but he wasn't ready to speak publicly yet. He was too busy trying to understand how his attempt to protect the neighborhood had turned into a national conversation about racial profiling. His wife, Jessica, sat beside him on the couch. Blake, maybe this is a chance for you to really learn something. Maybe this is an opportunity to become a better officer. Blake looked at her, then at the television screen showing another news report about the incident. I don't even know if I'll still be an officer when this is all over. Maybe that's not the most important question right now, Jessica said gently. Maybe the most important question is what kind of person you want to be moving forward. As the week ended, both Blake and Antonio were preparing for what would come next. Neither of them knew that this incident would eventually lead to a partnership that would change both of their lives and create a model for police reform that would be studied and implemented across the country. The video that had started as evidence of a problem would eventually become the foundation for a solution, but first, both men would have to confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves and the society they lived in. 6 months had passed since that evening on Elm Street, and the changes in both Blake Rodriguez and Antonio Williams were remarkable. What had started as one of the worst moments in both of their professional lives had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. Blake sat in a conference room at the police academy, preparing to address a group of new recruits. His hands weren't shaking anymore, but he still felt nervous before these presentations, not because he was afraid of public speaking, but because he was about to share one of the most embarrassing and educational experiences of his life. After his suspension, Blake had been given a choice: resign from the force or participate in an intensive rehabilitation program that would last 6 months. The program included bias training, community service, and most significantly, working directly with Dr. Williams on police reform initiatives. Blake had chosen the program, even though it meant months without pay, and no guarantee that he would be reinstated afterward. It had been one of the hardest decisions of his life, but also one of the most important. "Good morning, everyone," Blake said to the group of 25 recruits. "My name is Officer Blake Rodriguez, and I'm here to tell you about the biggest mistake I ever made as a police officer, and what it taught me about the job you're about to do." The recruits listened intently as Blake walked them through the events of that evening. He didn't spare any details or try to make himself look better. He explained his thought process, his assumptions, and the consequences of his actions. "I stopped Dr. Williams because I made assumptions based on his race and his presence in a predominantly white neighborhood," Blake said plainly. "I told myself I was just being cautious, just doing my job. But the truth is I was engaging in racial profiling, and I could have ruined an innocent man's life because of my own unconscious biases." One of the recruits raised her hand. "Officer Rodriguez, how did you realize what you had done wrong?" Blake smiled slightly. "That's the interesting part. It wasn't immediate. Even after I found out who Dr. Williams was, I was more concerned about how the incident would affect my career than about the impact it had on him. It took months of training, community service, and honest conversations before I really understood the depth of what I had done." Meanwhile, across town, Antonio was in his office preparing for his own presentation. He was scheduled to speak at a national conference on police-community relations, and his story had become a case study in how departments could transform incidents of misconduct into opportunities for growth. Antonio's approach had surprised many people. Instead of pursuing maximum punishment for Officer Rodriguez, he had advocated for a restorative justice approach that focused on education and transformation rather than just penalties. "The goal isn't revenge," Antonio had explained to critics who thought he was being too lenient. "The goal is to prevent these incidents from happening again. And sometimes the people who make these mistakes can become the most effective teachers if they're willing to do the work to understand what went wrong." The program that Antonio and Chief Gonzalez had developed together was now being studied by police departments across the country. Instead of simply punishing officers who engaged in misconduct, the program focused on understanding the root causes of bias and providing intensive education and community engagement opportunities. Blake's transformation had been remarkable. After completing his bias training, he had spent 3 months working in the community center in the neighborhood where he had grown up. He had tutored kids after school, helped organize community events, and most importantly, listened to residents' concerns about policing in their area. "Working in the community center changed everything for me," Blake explained to the recruits. "I got to know the people I was supposed to be serving and protecting. I heard their stories, their concerns, their experiences with police officers. It made me realize that my job isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about building trust and making communities safer for everyone. One of the most powerful aspects of Blake's transformation had been his partnership with Antonio. What had started as a professional relationship, based on Blake's need for rehabilitation, had evolved into a genuine friendship and collaboration. They had worked together to develop new training materials that used Blake's story as a teaching tool. They had visited schools together to talk about bias, fairness, and community relations. They had even appeared on television together to discuss their experience and the lessons it had taught them both. Dr. Williams could have easily ended my career, Blake told the recruits. Instead, he chose to help me become a better officer and a better person. That choice changed not just my life, but potentially the lives of everyone I'll interact with as a police officer for the rest of my career. Antonio's presentation at the national conference focused on the broader implications of their experience. Individual incidents of misconduct are symptoms of systemic problems, he explained to an audience of police chiefs, city officials, and civil rights advocates from across the country. If we only focus on punishing individuals without addressing the underlying culture and training issues, we'll keep seeing the same problems over and over again. The program they had developed included several key components: intensive bias training that went beyond simple awareness to actual behavior change, community service requirements that put officers in direct contact with the communities they served, mentorship programs that paired officers with community leaders, and ongoing evaluation and support to ensure lasting change. The success of this approach depends on the willingness of everyone involved to do the hard work of honest self-reflection and change, Antonio continued. Officer Rodriguez was willing to do that work, and the results speak for themselves. Blake had indeed been reinstated after completing the program, but he was a fundamentally different officer than he had been before. His approach to policing was more thoughtful, more community-focused, and more aware of the impact of his actions on the people he served. His colleagues had noticed the change. "Blake's become one of our best officers," Chief Gonzalez had told Antonio during one of their regular meetings. "He's more patient, more thoughtful, and he's become a mentor to other officers who are struggling with similar issues." The presentation Blake was giving to the recruits was part of the standard training curriculum now. Every new officer had to hear his story and understand the consequences of bias-based policing. "The most important thing I want you to understand," Blake concluded his presentation, "is that none of us are immune to bias. We all have unconscious assumptions and prejudices that can affect our judgment. The key is being aware of them and actively working to overcome them. And if you do make a mistake, the most important thing you can do is take responsibility, learn from it, and use that experience to become a better officer." After his presentation, Blake met with Antonio for their monthly coffee meeting. It had become a tradition that both men looked forward to. "How did the presentation go?" Antonio asked. "Good, I think." The recruits asked tough questions, which is exactly what they should be doing. Antonio smiled. "You know, when I first met you that night on Elm Street, I never would have imagined we'd be sitting here having coffee as colleagues and friends." Blake laughed. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be giving presentations about my own mistakes and working on police reform initiatives, I would have thought they were crazy." Their partnership had become a model for other departments dealing with similar incidents. The key, they had learned, was focusing on transformation rather than just punishment, and creating systems that supported long-term change rather than quick fixes. As they sat in the coffee shop, both men reflected on how much had changed since that evening when their lives had intersected in such an unexpected way. What had started as one of the worst experiences of their professional lives had become the foundation for work that was making a real difference in communities across the country. "You know what the best part is?" Blake said, looking out the window at the diverse neighborhood around them. "Every day now I get to use the worst mistake I ever made to help prevent other people from making the same mistake. That feels like redemption to me." Antonio nodded. "And every day, I get to see proof that people can change, that systems can improve, and that even the most difficult situations can become opportunities for growth and transformation. That gives me hope for the future." Their story had become more than just an incident of racial profiling and its consequences. It had become an example of what was possible when people were willing to confront their biases, do the hard work of change, and focus on solutions rather than just problems. The evening sun was setting as they finished their coffee, casting long shadows across the street. It reminded both of them of that evening 6 months ago when everything had changed. But now, instead of representing a moment of division and misunderstanding, those shadows represented the growth and transformation that had come from facing difficult truths and choosing to build something better from the experience.